Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Before I embark on my contribution to part two of this bill, can I also, like the Minister, make a couple of acknowledgements. The first is to the Unite Union. If it was not for the Unite Union, this issue would not be a political issue. We would not be considering this issue this evening. The second is to the Council of Trade Unions, who were there at the beginning of this legislative process and who have been an enormous source of information and knowledge and support in the period of time between the Select Committee and now, and before that during the Select Committee as well. Assuming all goes well tonight, and by the sounds of the Minister's comments, it sounds like things are going to go well tonight. I look forward to the opportunity to make a few more acknowledgements during the third reading. Can I also acknowledge the officials? The Minister is absolutely right. They have worked extremely hard on this legislation and ought to be acknowledged for that. Sir, I have a definition of a 0 hours contract. It's not unlike the Minister's. It is a permanent part-time agreement with no fixed hours. Permanent, i.e. not casual. Permanent in that the employee does have to come to work when they are told to come to work by the employer. Part-time, not full-time. No fixed hours, no guarantee of work. And that, I understand, is the term that was actually used, particularly in the fast food industry, for what we term a 0 hours contract, a permanent part-time agreement with no fixed hours. The result of that is people are literally stuck at home waiting for the phone call and then must go into work when the phone call comes. And the result of that is people can't plan their lives, they can't get a loan from the bank because they don't know how much income they're going to have, they can't get hire purchase agreements to buy a fridge or a bed or anything else like that. They can't join sports clubs because they don't know when they are and aren't going to be at work. They can't be available for their children sometimes. You know, if their children have got a sports game on a Saturday morning but they are suddenly called into work, or likewise if they've got a school play or something. You know, it just stops people being able to live an ordinary, decent life. And that's why we've got to get rid of them. And that's why I'm so hopeful that tonight will go well and the result will be that we will get rid of them. Now, there's certainly a difference of opinion about how significant the changes are that we are talking about making tonight. The government says they are minor. I'm less convinced about that. And I would like to go to start with, I would like to go to one of the changes, the first change made on my supplementary order paper number 155, which is changes to clause 87, new section 67E, because this is what changes this bill from a bill that entrenches 0 hour contracts to a bill that eliminates 0 hour contracts. And I understand, I absolutely understand that in the public's mind, that's a difficult concept, that a bill that we have been saying, and we are quite right in saying this, entrenches 0 hour contracts, could actually be changed significantly by only changing a couple of clauses, so significantly that we actually do a 180 turn and we end up with a bill that eliminates 0 hour contracts. It might be difficult to believe, I can barely believe it myself, but it is true, and that is what this amendment will do. So the issue we had with 67E when it came back from the Select Committee was 67E2, which said an availability provision may relate to all work performed under the employment agreement. In other words, all the work you did under that employment agreement would be subject to an availability provision, i.e., in layman's terms, you could be on call all the time with no guarantee of work. That's a 0 hours contract. That is the very definition of a 0 hours contract. That was the fatal flaw in the legislation. And that's the bit that we have desperately wanted to change. The other changes are important, there's no doubt about it. But the change to 67E2 is the linchpin. Without that, none of the rest of it really matters all that much. But with that, it changes the context for the rest of the bill, and it changes the context for the rest of the amendments that are proposed, both by the government and by the opposition. So this is the important one. For everybody out there who desperately wants Parliament to eradicate 0 hour contracts, this is the one that changes this bill from a bill that entrenches 0 hour contracts to a bill that eliminates 0 hour contracts. So instead of the availability provision relating to all work performed under the employment agreement, the availability provision may now only be included in an employment agreement that specifies agreed hours of work and that includes guaranteed hours of work amongst those agreed hours, Mr. Chairman.
Lees-Galloway.
It also must only relate to a period for which the employee is required to be available that is in addition to those guaranteed hours of work. What does that mean in real terms? It's the classic on-call situation that most people in this House will have experienced and a lot of workers have experienced. So to be asked to be on call, because that's essentially what an availability provision is, to ask to be on call, in other words, when the phone call comes, you have to go to work, that can only happen if you have guaranteed hours in your employment agreement. So you'll have your guaranteed hours, and then in addition to that, you may be on call. So in my younger days, I worked at a medical laboratory, I worked a shift during the day, and every fortnight or so I was on call overnight. I got an allowance for being on call because you do have to put your life on hold. You certainly can't drink, you can't go and play a game of football or whatever because the phone call comes and you have to go in. And if you went into work, then you get paid for the actual work that you do. That is a situation that we recognise well, and that is what is now going to be the case under this availability provision. So people who have previously been required to be available with absolutely no guarantee of work, now if you're required to be available, that only comes on top of guaranteed work. That eliminates zero-hour contracts when taken in the context of all the other provisions that are included in this legislation. So in the time I have remaining on this call, I want to address a question that I have been asked, and I really want the Minister to address this one as well. The question I've been asked is, what's to stop an employer giving someone one guaranteed hour and then putting them on the availability clause for the rest of the time? It's a fair question, and we have to answer that. So the answer to that comes in 67E 3BC, which says the proportion of the hours referred to in paragraph B, which is the number of hours for which the employee would be required to be available, the proportion of the hours in proportion to the agreed hours of work. So it would be disproportionate for someone to have one guaranteed hour and 39 hours where they have to be under an availability clause. Now, obviously, what is reasonable will have to be tested, but that would be disproportionate. That would be an onerous contract. And let this House be clear, that is not what we intend at all. If a judge has to look back at this debate and has to figure out what our intention was, I want it to be absolutely clear, we do not intend that employers would be able to give people a very small number of guaranteed hours and then require them to be on a much larger number of hours or available for a much larger number of hours. The weighting should go majority of time guaranteed, a few hours, the lesser number of hours under the availability provision. That has to be our clear intention from this House, and I really want the Minister to contribute at some point in time this evening to make it clear that that is the government's view as well, because without that, really, we're potentially window dressing, and we really need to ensure that that's the case. I'm confident that is the case. I just think we have to be absolutely clear in this House that that is our intention. Mr. Chairman. That's, I thought you were going to cut me off there for a second, Mr. Chairman. No, so Mr. Chairman, there are certainly other aspects of Part 2 that I'm very keen to speak on, but not being able to see your clock, sir, I've got no idea how much time I've got left. 1 minute. Okay, well, I'll talk briefly to the cancellation of shifts, because that's the other thing that my SOP does, and actually you need some bits from my SOP and you need some bits from the government's SOP to actually deal with the cancellation of shifts issue completely. But what we don't want to have happen is the situation where employers can cancel a shift at the last minute. That was another aspect of the whole 0 hours contract regime that was inequitable and it was exploitative of workers. So we want to make it absolutely clear that workers must have a reasonable period of notice for cancellation, and if they don't get that reasonable period of cancellation, then compensation must be paid. Furthermore, that notice period of cancellation must be included in the employee's employment agreement so they know up front what the situation is, what the period of cancellation is, and that must be a reasonable notice period, sir.
The Honourable Mike Woodhouse.